Dear students, welcome to Epg Pad and this is Professor G. Srinivas Reddy, retired Professor of Public Administration, Kakti University, Warangal, Telangana State. Today we are going to do a module on centralization and decentralization. And in the next presentation or the next lecture, we will try to understand delegation and deconcentration. These two themes are interrelated and therefore these lectures are delivered in sequence. The scheme of the lecture will be like this. Firstly, I'll locate the context of decentralization and centralization. Secondly, I'll define the terms centralization and decentralization. Thirdly, I'll narrate what are the various types of decentralization. Fourthly, I'll explain the merits and demerits of centralization and decentralization. Finally, I'll conclude by picking up the threads from the whole presentation. So this is the scheme of lecture. Now we shall go to the context of centralization and decentralization. Perhaps you're aware that there are different theories of public administration. And the first and the foremost is called the classical theory. The classical theory is also known as structuralist theory. The most important point in classical theory is that it gives primacy or importance to structure. Stephen Robbins, who talks about the structure of organization, says that there are three things which are important in the structure of organization or in structuring an organization. The first is the complexity of the organization. Second is formalization. The third is centralization. If you want to build an organizational structure, these are the three important phenomena. Let me just repeat: the complexity of the organization, the formalization in the organization, and thirdly, the centralization. And in addition to this, Henry Fayol, who is considered to be the father of modern management, he has enlisted 14 principles of management, which by adaptation may be considered to be principles of administration and also public administration. Among these principles, he would list out the principle of centralization and decentralization. What it essentially means is that an organization can never be totally centralized nor decentralized. The idea posited is that there is a centralization and decentralization are a continuum. Centralization is the extreme way in which the power is concentrated. Decentralization is positing the other extreme. Now we try to see the definition of these two terms. Centralization is a systematic way of concentrating power in the higher reaches of the organization or in the higher levels of the organization or with the topmost officers of the organization. Whereas decentralization is the reverse of it. It is the diffusion of power from the head office to field offices, from the top level officers to the lower level officers, from the people in the headquarters to the operatives who are right on the field doing the various activities for which the organization is meant. Now, centralization and decentralization do not take place in vacuum. Centralization or decentralization has to be done in the context of an organization. And what I mean by the context is, what is the complexity of the organization? What is the level of formalization in the organization? What is the age of the organization? And what is the geographical spread of the organization? And what is the functional mix of the organization? I think if these things are too many and all that, I think there is one kind of thing that is supposed to be done: centralization or decentralization. And these are some of the important factors. Centralization and decentralization have their own merits and demerits. The merits of centralization are conversely the demerits of centralization. Other words, the demerits of centralization are almost automatically the merits of decentralization. So keeping this point in view, I'll now discuss about the merits of centralization. Centralization leads to uniformity. Now, in a country like India, which is, I think it's one of the third world countries, and there were many challenges when the country got independence, and one of the most important challenges was that of national integration. Whether the country would remain united in the long run, and integration and assuming India as an organization. I think this was the need of the hour. If you look at the Indian Constitution, there has been large amount of centralization of powers with the central government, and the central government is not only given its powers in the union list, but the residuary powers are also given to the union government. And this has proved good in the long run for India. India has remained a country, whereas our neighbor who got separated from India, Pakistan, got split into two pieces. So this demonstrates the fact for integrity of the organization, centralization is desirable. The second important thing in centralization is that there will be clarity of authority. Now, there is just one common superior, and everybody knows what is the seat of power. So everybody can run to that particular person or particular authority to get things done. So this is the clarity in the organization will be there. Thirdly, there will be uniformity. Now, people working in the organization tend to get uniform treatment if there is centralization. So uniformity, integrity, and speed is also another important thing. The decision making source being one, quick decisions are made. In a decentralized system, so many people, I think one good example of decentralization could be a board type of system. Now, there are some public sector organizations which are headed by boards. So board depends on collective decision making. To reach collective decision making, quite some time is lost, and therefore centralization leads to speed in the organization. Okay, these are some of the major advantages of centralization. Now, coming to decentralization, the advantage of decentralization is that more and more people are involved in administration. Decentralization leads to participative administration. In the absence of participative administration, when one person is calling all the shots, only one person is given all the authority, I think there is clogging of authority, there is clogging of things at one place. I think things will be queued up, and the chief executive may not find time to deal with every important aspect. So therefore, there will be delay. I think what was got as speed is now nullified. There will be delay. Certain things can be taken care of, and obviously the chief executive, who is given all the power, would concentrate on certain things, and he is by necessity is forced not to pay attention to certain other things, however important they are. So therefore, certain things get neglected also. Secondly, the succession management. I think in any organization, people retire, they reach their age of superannuation, people get transferred, and at the higher reaches of the organization, there should be people who have experience to handle. I think in decentralization, people get to have experience of taking decisions because the authority is given to the lowest person also. I'll give one good example of LG company from the private sector, where there is the concept of employee empowerment. The lowest operative executive in LG can take decisions independently. LG has 48% of market share in certain white goods. I think just one company vying with so many companies could garner 48% of the market share is largely because of this decentralization. The lowest fellow is given authority to decide things, and therefore things don't wait. Another important advantage of decentralization is experimentation is possible. If in a vast country like ours, or in a huge organization which runs into the entire length and breadth of the country, maybe one of the central government departments, if some innovation has to be made, or if something has to be introduced, And if you introduce straight away throughout the length and breadth of the country, one doesn't know whether that's the right thing to do or wrong thing to do. Most likely, sometimes it may so happen that the experiment may boomerang and it may not give the intended results. Therefore, the whole country suffers. And instead, in decentralization, power and authority are distributed among so many people. People at some level, they can use their imagination, and because of autonomy that they would enjoy, they would experiment somewhere, and an experiment which is successful in some corner of the country can be replicated all over the country, or it can be tried out in few other corners of the country which have different socio-political, geographical climate and compulsions. And after that, I think after these trial runs, that can be extended to the whole of the country. This is what is known as the scope for experimentation in decentralization. One more important thing in decentralization is that the leadership qualities will blossom up in a decentralized organization. In a centralized organization, initiative is stifled. If somebody takes any interest in doing something, he is not the person who is really authorized to do that, and he cannot move forward. Maybe every employee may have some good ideas. Maybe because of the experience one has, one gets some good ideas, and these ideas are not really allowed to blossom into some administrative actions because of centralization. Under centralization, the chief executive, even if he is a very enlightened person, may not have enough time and patience and the opportunity to understand all such good things and then give permission for experimentation. One more important advantage of decentralization is that the people will get the opportunity of meeting the decision centers. In a democracy, this is very important. In a democratic dispensation, it's important that people should have the decision-making centers closer to their place of residence or place of working. And decentralization makes it possible. I think this apart, I think there are some historical reasons also why centralization. Of course, let me just also mention that decentralization has its own demerits, in the sense that there is one, lack of uniformity. Second, lack of uniformity in the sense that since the lower level units, field units and lower level persons are given the necessary authority to take decisions, they may decide in diverse ways. And maybe some of these ways are unacceptable too. So this is one problem. Second problem is that cohesion in the organization will be missing. I think in emergencies, the whole organization has to move in single file, and such cases there may be a problem. In a decentralized organization, to move everybody in unison to the line of the higher level authorities may be difficulty. So therefore, in organizations which deal with emergency situations, maybe the firefighting department and all that, there is heavy centralization of authority. In military, again, there is centralization of authority because the whole personnel of military have to move in single file. And therefore, centralization or decentralization, in one kind of generalization, one can say that in development departments, in welfare departments, decentralization is more required. In regulatory departments, I think students of public administration are aware that there are two kinds of departments, two kinds of organizations: regulatory organizations and development organizations. Regulatory organizations deal with law and order, currency, coinage, collection of taxation and all that, where centralization is recommended. In developmental departments, there is need for decentralization. So they have their own uses depending on the nature of department. And one more thing is that in a very old organization, the procedures will be set. I think in an organization, there can be, if the organization is pretty old and things are tried out and all policies and procedures are well ironed out, and therefore there can be centralization. Whereas in young organizations, there is need for decentralization because people have to take decisions depending on the circumstances, and the circumstances are novel. They're not the circumstances under which they worked in the past. So therefore, these are all some of the factors. Now we have to add another important point that these days there is internet revolution. So the people call this as third wave or the third kind of revolution. In fact, mankind has benefited from three revolutions. One is agricultural revolution, second is industrial revolution, the third is electronic revolution. And thanks to electronic revolution, we have this Epg Pad 2. Now, information is at fingertips. Decentralization was needed in the past because to reach out a remote area, to enable a person to take a decision, communication was a big bottleneck in the older times. There was no telephone, there was no cell phone, and it was very difficult to reach out. I think I'm talking about the administration in the past, like in the ancient and medieval periods, or even in modern periods, some of the far-off areas which are cut off from communication and all that, decentralization is recommended. Whereas centralization is becoming possible more and more because of electronic revolution, www, World Wide Net. You get information, you can get commands, you can get reports, you can get communication, you can get progress reports. You can have, in fact, a look at what is happening. I think there is interactive video communication between head office and field offices. I think there is not much of a need for perhaps if the chief executive wants to decentralize, he can decentralize well to the lower units, power can be assigned, and what exactly they are doing can be watched by the people sitting in the head office without much difficulty. So therefore, technology is also a variable. Depending on technology, centralization or decentralization, which one is important can be decided. Depending on the age of the organization, also technology and all these things can be, the centralization, the quantum of centralization and decentralization may be decided. Now I'll come to next part of the lecture, and that's about the types of decentralization. One of the decentralizations is known as administrative decentralization. Administrative decentralization is also known as deconcentration. Administrative decentralization is different from political decentralization. The political decentralization can be known as devolution. In deconcentration, the concentration of the powers is reduced and power is distributed between many people, and this is deconcentration. There is a reduction of concentration in some levels, and when this power is given, this power is shared and it is given as a kind of original power, this becomes devolution. Now, to cite some examples which are familiar to students of public administration, the 73rd and 74th Constitution Amendment Acts are good examples of devolution, the political decentralization, so to say. Under these acts, the local bodies, the urban and rural local bodies are given original powers, which cannot be trampled by the state governments. Earlier, it was so happening that the state governments were not conducting elections to local bodies regularly. They were not allowing the democratic element to operate, and they were often superseding the bodies and appointing special officers and bringing the local bodies under their control. They were perpetually postponing elections, and some of these things cannot happen that easily now with 73rd and 74th Constitutional Amendment Acts, which have brought in political decentralization, which is, in other words, known as devolution. There can be financial decentralization also. Financial decentralization means all the budget being operated from head office or by the higher level officers. The budget is also distributed. Some budget is given to lower level organizations. Or conversely, instead of dividing the purse between the head office and lower level offices, in decentralization there can be the ceiling of expenditure by the lower level units or lower level functionaries can be raised. Say, for example, They are currently empowered to spend up to 5,000 rupees. A decision involving rupees 5,000 of expenditure, a lower level field level functionary can now take. Assume that is the position. And financial decentralization, which is also referred to as fiscal decentralization, would mean raising that limit to 10,000 or 15,000. So this is what is meant by financial decentralization. One more thing is functional decentralization. Now, instead of clogging all functions into one department, I think we have a lot of functional decentralization in Indian administration. I think students, you are aware that we have a kind of service known as All India Service, All India Services. The Indian Administrative Service is an important All India service, and the Indian Administrative Service officers are they undertake all kinds of functions. They are omnibus functionaries. All the functions are given to them. Now, this also brings in the concept of generalist and specialist. Now, a generalist is given all the functions, and it's not only the natural condition. It's not the only way administration can be done. These functions can be separated. There can be functional heads who will take decisions. But in functional decentralization, what happens is coordination is a problem. I think the concept of All India Services and an omnibus functionary, a functionary who deals with all kinds of government departments, is recommended for coordination. And coordination is also one of the principles of administration. Centralization, decentralization, devolution may be some good principles, but coordination is another principle. So in the interest of coordination, sometimes functional decentralization is not recommended. Functional decentralization really leads to the specialists calling the shots. A functional specialist can take a final decision under functional decentralization, which is not possible if all the functions are combined together. Now, there can be symbolic decentralization also. Now, sometimes decentralization without any purpose, you just distribute the powers and all that. Maybe it may, maybe unwittingly, there may be some of these things may incidentally happen, but decentralization for the sake of decentralization also can be done. One more important aspect that needs to be considered in the context of the concept of centralization and decentralization is the colonial history. I think India is a country which has got freedom from the colonial masters after a protracted struggle, and because of the requirements of the colonial rule, the colonial masters, the British colonial power has concentrated all the powers. I think the concentration of powers, either in the hands of the district collector or IAS officers or the central government being very powerful, in a way is a hangover of the colonial administration. Of course, it also did serve the purpose of national integration, but colonial dimension also cannot be missed out in this. So therefore, in a country, in a system of administration, whether you will have centralization or decentralization perhaps depends on the historical aspects too. And just one more aspect I would like to mention, that in India for a very long time there was one party rule since independence to, I believe, in the late 60s. In some of the states, the opposition party started coming into power. Till then, it was monolithic power. The Congress party was ruling both at the center and in the states. And therefore, there was large degree of centralization. But from this time onwards, the impetus for decentralization increased. And the result is a lot of thinking about reinventing center-state relations, refurbishing local bodies and giving constitutional status to local bodies, and so many commissions and committees being appointed. I think with the increasing democratization of society, I think in our society it's not only that the opposition parties, I think today we are in a situation of a multi-party polity, from a uni-party polity. For some time, Congress was the only party dominating. There was virtually no opposition even. But later, now a situation has come, there is virtually no opposition, there is a ruling party. Once again, the pendulum is swinging, but so many multiple political parties have come with varying ideologies and all that, and this is a ground for decentralization. Another factor that needs to be added to as a force for decentralization is the emergence of subaltern castes and classes. I think power was wielded by mostly the upper caste for very long time, and there has been first emergence of the peasant caste, which are not ritually upper caste, but peasant castes have captured power, and OBCs and scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, and every single section of the society in Indian society is asserting for their power, and with this there is growing impetus for decentralization. Well, let me just recap all that has been said. In this module, we try to understand the concepts of centralization and decentralization and their theoretical locale in the classical theory as principles of administration. And we have seen the definitions of these two important terms, major terms, the advantages and disadvantages of centralization and decentralization, and the factors that militate in favor or against centralization and decentralization. With this, I conclude my presentation, and students, if you have any questions, you're most welcome to ask. My dear students, I think this has been in a nutshell the story of centralization and decentralization. There is the script that is supplied to you, and the PPTs are also there, and the websites also will give you a lot of information. You are encouraged to go through all of them and engage in debates about the merits and demerits of centralization and decentralization in your own context, taking live examples from your own life situations, and that will further concretize the concepts and make you understand them more clearly. Thank you.